The histories of China and colonialism are very much interlinked. However, with the exception of histories of Hong Kong, most Western scholarship until very recently has neglected this history. And instead, China's relations with the West have been euphemistically characterized as diplomacy or trade or informal empire. And this is in contrast with Chinese scholarship, in which the history of colonialism is very, very central to narratives of modern history. While it's true that foreigners initially came to China to trade rather than to govern in the 18th century, and also even after the conflicts of the mid-19th century, known as the Opium Wars, very little territory was under the direct control of foreign powers. If we look more critically at this history, we can see that foreigners extended their influence in China through a series of treaties, which granted very extensive privileges to foreign interests. For example, foreigners were given privileges of trade and residence. They were given the ability to proselytize, and also they enjoyed the privileges of extraterritoriality, which meant that they were not subject to the legal systems of China. Moreover, foreign interests had control over major state institutions, such as the Chinese Maritime Customs Service, over key infrastructure, such as railway systems, and over the financial and banking sector. They also ran independent councils and police forces. So what we can see is that in China, various colonial practices and systems of rule were replicated and modified in the Chinese context. There is, of course, a very broad spectrum of different colonial practices and systems of rule around the world, but China's experiences definitely fall on this spectrum. One of the most interesting aspects of the history of colonialism in China for me is that it was a multinational endeavor. Whereas in most other colonial territories, only one single power would dominate. In China, instead, we have many, many different foreign powers competing and also cooperating. So the treaty ports were places where multiple colonial interests converged and overlapped and sometimes competed. This means that the treaty ports were extraordinarily cosmopolitan places. To walk through a treaty port, such as Tianjin, which had 9 different foreign concessions, was to literally walk across imperial borders. And to add to this, the Qing government itself was a colonial power that had built its own empire through a process of expansion. So this leads to lots of very interesting scenarios of cooperation and conflict between different colonial powers. More than anything, I find the people who inhabited the treaty ports very, very interesting. And in my research, I like to explore their motivations for going to China and the ways in which they negotiated the cosmopolitan environment of the treaty ports. I think that more than anything, studying the history of colonialism shows that China's new global role is not unprecedented. Often, China is portrayed as being very isolationist in history and being very reluctantly forced into greater interactions with the outside world. But we can see from studying this time period that China was really integrated into colonial webs and networks of trade and migration and knowledge exchange. Besides this, China is often portrayed as a victim of foreign aggression in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But if we look more closely at the politics of this era, we can see how subsequent or successive Chinese governments, they actively tried to negotiate a better position for China. So even in this period of colonialism and imperialism, China was playing an active role in the global order. And I think that now that China actually has the upper hand in many of its overseas relationships and has even been accused of neocolonialism in its relationship with certain regions, particularly with Africa, this history of colonialism and of China's global role is very, very pertinent. I think that the turbulence of the past 2 centuries in China and the very, very dramatic changes that have occurred over this time period have really shaped present-day culture and politics. So therefore, a historical perspective can help us to understand this. I think that history often makes things which seem strange and incomprehensible in the present day understandable. So aspects of Chinese politics and culture that might seem at first very unfamiliar or difficult to understand can be made comprehensible through a historical perspective. I also think that history is always very controversial and very political because historical national narratives and myths shape understandings of who we are and where we come from and what we can be. And all of this means that knowing China's history and also how that history is understood in China, this can help us to understand how people in China view their place in the world in the present day. And particularly, it can help us to understand why China's increasing relationship with the outside world might be viewed with a certain unease and wariness.